We spent a lot of time covering higher-end hardware in the past few weeks with 1080 Ti's, 1070 Ti's, and RX Vegas galore, with many a comparison being made between GPUs that can hit 1440p and 4K gaming at 60 FPS, and my incessant complaints that Vega sucks. It's easy to get lost in all of the options that we have at our disposal as PC gamers. But regardless of AMD versus Nvidia, Intel versus AMD, Raja Kaduri versus Lisa Su, us PC gamers can agree on one thing. Console gamers aren't as good as us. Console gamers and the uninitiated masses love to go on about how expensive PC building can be, and it can be really hard to blame them sometimes. The PC gaming market is continuously flooded with monstrous CPUs, graphics cards, motherboards, and other components that cost about as much as the GDP of the Nilfgaardian Empire. Actually, no, the Nilfgaardian Empire is loaded, but you get the point. PC gaming can be a quick road to the poorhouse if you're looking for a high-end, maximum performance machine that'll make mincemeat out of any new and upcoming games for the next 2 years or so. But people who are just looking to dip their toes into the PC gaming waters without taking out a second mortgage, or veteran PC gamers on a super tight budget, aren't entirely out of luck. In fact, far from it. Most companies and manufacturers make products specifically aimed at consumers with tight belts, and they usually perform phenomenally well for the price. Nowadays, you can pick up a chassis, motherboard, power supply, RAM, and more than capable CPU and still have some cash left over for a touch of RGB if that gets your juices flowing. But once you get all of those sorted, it's time to look into buying a graphics card, which often proves to be the most expensive part of a new gaming rig. Luckily, market competition between AMD and Nvidia has never been more heated, and both companies are offering consumers reasonably powerful GPUs at even more reasonable prices. Case in point, Nvidia's GT 1030 priced at a paltry $67, about 1,200 Rand locally, and then AMD's RX 550 priced at about $85 or 1,600 Rand and up locally as well. Today, I'll be taking a look at both the red and green team's most recent ultra-low-end desktop GPUs, or more specifically, I'll be putting the two cards head-to-head to see which one comes out on top in gaming and which one just makes the most sense to buy. On the green team, we have the Zotac GeForce GT 1030, which comes in with a hefty boost core clock of 1,671 MHz, is equipped with 2 GB of VRAM, and sports an impressive TDP of only 30 watts. Coming in to represent the red team is PowerColor's Red Dragon RX 550, featuring a core clock speed of 1,190 MHz, 2 gigs of VRAM, and a TDP of 50 watts. Now, neither card requires an additional power connector, but as should be readily apparent, that's where the similarities end. While the GT 1030 dominates when it comes to pure core clock speed, low TDP, and lower price, the RX 550 seems to be the more rounded card overall, equipped with a superior memory interface and noticeably more stream processors, among other things, but specs alone rarely tell the full story. With that in mind, I fired up a few games to see what kind of performance difference we're dealing with between the cards, if any, and the results were expected. The RX 550 absolutely destroyed the GT 1030 in all 8 of the games I tested, as well as in 3D Mark's Time Spy, and by no small margin. Even with the GT 1030's massive clock speed advantage, it just couldn't keep up with the RX 550. That being said, both cards perform remarkably well at 1080p, running most games, including relatively resource-hungry ones, at least a playable 30 frames per second. I'd usually benchmark cards like these at around 720p, since that's probably the resolution people will be buying them for or aiming at, but I wanted to show just how capable these budget GPUs can act. I mean, I wouldn't recommend running most games at 1080p with these cards, since there are major FPS and improved graphical quality settings to be had at 720p, but 1080p at decent settings and 60 FPS plus should be more than attainable in esports titles like Overwatch and the like. This impressive showing gets even more impressive once you start overclocking these ultra-low budget beasts, or at least in the case of the GT 1030. NVIDIA's Pascal architecture overclocks exceptionally well, regardless if you're running a GTX 1080 Ti or a GT 1030. Boosting both core and memory speeds on the GT 1030 was an absolute breeze, and I only experienced stability issues when I approached unrealistically high numbers at just above stock voltage. Still, even at a pretty mild overclock, pushing the GT 1030's core clock to 1,848 MHz and memory to just over 6.4 GHz, the performance gains were immediately noticeable. Games like Deus Ex Mankind Divided that struggled a little to stick to a solid 30 FPS at stock had no such issues with the card overclocked, and other titles that already ran buttery smooth showed an even higher FPS number across the board. All of that came with a max temp of only 72 degrees as well. Yes, the GT 1030 overclocks much like you'd expect it to, which is really well and really easy. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about the RX 550. Overclocking this card was an arduous and time-consuming thing, and I'm still not entirely sure why AMD has to make things so difficult. First off, none of the overclocking tools that I usually use, like MSI's Afterburner, actually worked without a hitch. There was always something preventing even mild overclocks from holding stable, and even worse, some utilities straight up wouldn't allow me to save any changes. Sliders dropped back to their stock settings after attempting to apply them, and in the rare cases where an overclock did stick, the card bombed or caused artifacting not too long afterwards. Heck, I even tried multiple AMD drivers to no avail. But after some research, I decided to see if AMD's own Wattman overclocking utility would yield better results, and it did, sort of, but by that I mean I was able to tweak clock speeds without having them reset themselves or crashing the drivers, which is a great success. Unfortunately, my excitement was a little premature because while I was finally able to overclock the card, it wasn't anything spectacular. The highest I could get the core clock to run stable at was 1226 MHz, and memory clock was stuck at 7.2 GHz. But hey, even a mild OC is better than no OC, right? Wrong. With that overclock applied, the RX 550 performed worse than it did at stock speeds in an alarming number of games, which proves that the overclock was unstable. And in others, the FPS numbers were almost identical. I mean, I know I didn't push the card all that hard with the OC settings I went with, but at the very least, it shouldn't have performed worse than it did at stock. That being said, multiple users have been able to push their RX 550s to much higher clock and memory speeds, but it appears that we lost the Silicon lottery on this GPU gamble. But I didn't feel much need to overclock the 550, and to be entirely honest, I didn't necessarily want to. Gains from overclocking the RX 550 seemed far too insignificant to warrant such an endeavor, especially with how difficult it was, and with a max temp approaching 80 degrees, it's not a particularly cool one anyways. If you do decide to pick up either the RX 550 or the GT 1030 and plan to overclock, you'll get far better mileage out of the GT 1030, period. It has a lot more legroom over what it's being shipped with, so you should expect to get better value for the cash you spend on the 1030. But even so, an overclocked GT 1030 still doesn't hold much of a candle to the RX 550 at stock. Performance-wise, the stock RX 550 still reigns supreme in more than half of the benchmarks I ran, and faster clock speeds from the GT 1030 isn't going to do a whole heck of a lot to change that anytime soon, unless somehow you can get this tiny little thing, to run at 2.1 gigahertz. Taking all of that into consideration, it's about time I get to the point of this video. That being, which card will give you the most bang for your buck? Even knowing what we do now, the answer isn't entirely clear. The GT 1030 is an amazing little card that gets the job done, overclocks like a champ, and does it all at an extremely enticing price point and low TDP. It's also super power efficient and stays surprisingly cool in all circumstances, even with this tiny fan. They can be so cool that certain models are entirely passively cooled, vastly reducing your system's noise output. So if all of that sounds good to you, you won't be disappointed. However, I'd still personally go with the RX 550. Yes, it's more power hungry, runs hotter, is harder to overclock, and most importantly, costs more than the GT 1030, but there's no getting around its performance straight out of the box. The card is a trooper that delivers exactly what it sets out to, and it outperforms the GT 1030 enough to make up for the price difference between them. My Power Color Red Dragon RX 550 also subjectively looks a whole lot better than that Zotac GT 1030. Not great, mind you, just better. There's really no competition when it comes to the full shrouds versus a heatsink. In short though, if you're looking for a budget card that'll run esports titles like a dream and will play most newer games without too much difficulty, you actually can't go wrong with either the GT 1030 or RX 550. But if you got the extra 10 bucks or so, it'll probably be best spent on Team Red. But I also know that at this price point and section of people looking to buy these types of GPUs, you likely need the cheapest new thing on the market, and by that margin, the GT 1030 is a much better bang for your buck than the 550. If you're willing to overclock, getting slightly near within the reach of the 550's performance for $15 less is a massive nearly 20% cost savings. Cheapening out and grabbing the NVIDIA card? I never thought I'd say those words. It would be the ideal choice for the gamer who can't spend the extra dough. That statement is even more true here in South Africa, where you can pick up the GT 1030 for only 1,300 Rand, while most 550s are going for the equivalent of $30 more at 1,800 Rand plus. That means that the local pricing of the 550 is 50% more than the GT 1030. But even though the AMD card is quicker, it's now 50% quicker, and it's really difficult to recommend at the price point it sits at because it starts intruding on GTX 1050 and RX 560 pricing territory there. Sometimes though, life throws you a curveball before you have time to film a comparison between GPUs, and Newegg starts offering the Power Color 550 with a $20 rebate, making it $10 cheaper than the GT 1030, and thus a no-brainer to recommend at $65 in the US. Speaking of no-brainers though, if you're in South Africa and are looking to pick up the budget GT 1030 or any other part you may need for your rig, Wootware is the obvious choice for making that next PC upgrade a reality. With a fantastic selection, darn near unbeatable prices, and a customer service team that won't throw you a curveball or offer you any bamboozles, Wootware is the place you should go next time you need to woot up your computer. So if you're in South Africa, head on over to wootware.co.za to woot up your life. The link will be in the video description. Big thanks to Wootware, by the way, for sending both the GT 1030 and RX 550 over for review. Wouldn't have been able to do it without you guys. Which, speaking of, I wouldn't be able to have a YouTube channel without all of you, the people watching this. Hello out there. So let me know what you think of the low-end options we have from Team Red and Team Green. Which one would you prefer to pick up? Do you like the fact that they don't have to use an external power connector? Would you pick up a GT 1030 and overclock it, or just leave it at bone stock? Let's have that conversation either down below or over on Twitter. I'm at UFDisciple. Also, be sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed this low-end showdown and want to let us know if we should spend more time focusing on low-end hardware. You can subscribe to stay up to date on all of our tech-related content. I am Brett with the UFDisciple channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers. We spent a lot of time covering higher-end hardware in the last few weeks, from 1080 Ti's, 1070 Ti's, and RX Vegas galore. Oh, that was bad. That box is. I don't have the cheap graphics cards. Here we go. An AMD's Radeon RX. Oh, wow, boy, hey card.